Hi, this is Jeff with Catholic Men of America, and I'm happy today to have with me Raymond Toma. Raymond, hi.
Good. Go by Danny, though. Yeah.
All right. So Danny has written a book. We're going to get into that, but Danny, I want to talk with you a little bit about your life, your faith experience, and your career. You've had an exciting career. Lots of stories, I'm sure, that you could tell that I think men will be interested in. Mm-hmm. So let's start at the beginning. Tell us about your family and your origin story.
Okay. Well, I live here in Oxford, Mississippi. I went to Ole Miss, went to University of Mississippi, and lived here. And I was drawn back here after my career because, as everyone knows, Oxford, Mississippi is the center of the universe. When I was in school, we had the mayor at that time, John Leslie. He used to meet with some of the incoming freshmen, and he told them of that fact about Oxford being the center of the universe, and could prove it because he told them, go every day, if you go any day of the week at noon to the downtown courthouse square and look up, he said, you'll see the sun passes right over the cupola of the courthouse, thus proving his fact. So this is why I came back here, and my parents are here. And so I've been back now after retirement. It's been 11 years now. And doing a little writing. I still occasionally do work for the State Department. My wife is here with me. I've got, well, I might say 1.5 of my 4 children live here in town. One works up in Memphis and still technically lives here, but sometimes stays up with the family of his girlfriend, since it's a little closer up there. She's from the area. And then my daughter works from home, so she's here. I've got one son and his family, and my 3 grandchildren in North Carolina, and then another son up in Memphis as well. But that's a little bit about my family. 3 grandchildren, 4 children, and I'm very, very happy to say that we all show up for the traditional mass. All except my family in North Carolina. We all show up to traditional mass at the same place on Sunday morning up in Memphis at St. Cecilia's Chapel. So that's always nice that if I don't see them any other time, I at least get to see them all on Sunday morning.
Now, there are not a lot of Catholics in Oxford, Mississippi. Did you grow up Catholic?
No, I did not. So I'm a convert. I grew up in the Churches of Christ, and here in Oxford back at that time, when I was in college, back in the 80s, we had a fairly dynamic preacher who was of the mind of, don't listen to what I say, but check it out for yourself. And I kind of took that to heart. For those of you all not familiar with the Churches of Christ, this is an American movement started around early 1800s. And the idea was to get back to the first century church. Obviously, they took a lot of, you might say, Protestant prejudices with them in reconstructing that. But there were a lot of people who are in that movement who are really interested in finding out, okay, just what did they believe? And so a lot of people in that denomination study things about the first century. Even people study Koine Greek, which I never did. But one thing that they don't do is read the church fathers. But I remember at the time, in my naivete, I thought, well, why not read some of these people who were closest in time, some of them, actual disciples of St. John the Evangelist, and because that who better to know what people did in the first and early second century than the people who lived in the first and early second century. And what happened, to make a long story short, I began discovering that they actually sounded very Catholic. And this was a period of years. And there was another little A that I'll talk about in a little while when we get talking about the book. But to make a long story short, is it was really going through people like St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. Polycarp of Smyrna, later writers that made me realize that the first century church still existed and was the Roman Catholic Church.
Fascinating. And you had some unique experiences while you were still a Protestant. You began praying the Rosary.
Yes. So, back pre-internet days, I became Catholic in 1990. So pre-internet days, you had to write off for a lot of stuff. And of course, because I was, when I first was studying about the Catholic Church, it wasn't so much at that time initially to, think about becoming Catholic. It was to, bring Catholics to Christ, as it were, from our perspective. And so I wanted in order to be able to do that, I had to learn what Catholics believe. So I wrote off to a lot of stuff, a lot of different organizations, a lot of different bookstores and so on. And as a result, it's like spam mail on the email today. Back then it was, spam snail mail. And so I was getting all sorts of stuff in the mail, most of which just promptly ended up in the trash can. But one day, I got this little pamphlet in the mail on how to pray the Rosary. So I looked at that, and I was far enough along in my studies that I wasn't just knee-jerk anti-Catholic. A few years before, this is, pagan or idolatrous or what have you, I would have thrown it right in the trash. But this time I was willing to take a look, and I looked at some of the prayers. I said, well, okay, the Our Father, even though in the Church of Christ, because it's a written prayer, they don't tend to pray the Our Father, despite the fact that it was actually given to us by Jesus himself. But by this point in time, I realized, yes, the Our Father is actually a good thing. So there's that. And then I looked at the Hail Mary, and as I looked at it, I realized, well, this is actually directly from the Bible. And then as I looked at some of the meditations, I said, well, these are good things to think about. And so I began, after some contemplation, some meditation, some prayer, I thought, well, I can start praying these. Now, I did leave off the last two glorious mysteries at the time, because that was just a bridge too far, you might say. But so I started, 4 or 5 years before I became Catholic, actually praying the Rosary. And in fact, I still have at home in a little box what I call my Protestant Rosary, which is the one I used to use at that time. But that's how it started. And as I mentioned in my book, it's one of those kind of things where be careful if you start praying the Rosary, because Our Lady will listen and intercede for you and draw you closer to her Son and to his church.
It's dangerous for any Protestant to start praying the Rosary. Right?
It is, yeah.
Now, at this time, you had a unique job. You were teaching on a Choctaw reservation. Is that right?
Right. So when I was at Ole Miss, I've been blessed to have some pretty cool jobs. When I was teaching, when I was studying, I worked at Roanoke, which is the house of the novelist William Faulkner, which is here in Oxford, the museum owned by the university. So I worked there as assistant curator for 5 years, and that was, except for the pay, which was really low because it was a student position, probably the best job I ever had, because anybody who came to Oxford, Mississippi had to wanted to go out and see Faulkner's house. So I met the Peruvian novelist Mario Vargas Llosa one time. Gave him a tour of the house. A lot of Hollywood type personalities came out. A lot of political people. And that was a lot of fun. And then, of course, I graduated, and I had graduated from law school. And another very long story, but I'll keep it very short. I had already decided I didn't want to practice law. At one point in time, I wanted to go into politics, and law was a means to an end. And I realized I wasn't the kind of person that was good to go into politics, because it would have been all about me. But I went through with law school anyway, and don't regret it, because it was very good discipline, particularly study discipline, which I didn't have. Did that, looking maybe at something involving foreign affairs long term. But I had to do something to make money in the meantime. So I fell back on my undergraduate degree, which was in education. The Choctaw Indian Reservation at that time was transferring its school system from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to a reservation system, a tribal school system. So they were looking for new teachers. And as a preface to that, the way I found out about this is where law school ties in, and my whole family. Basically, everything about this my life as it exists right now would not exist but for one day out at the Faulkner House. So I was in my last semester of law school. I had a course in school law, which was a paper course. And I was doing a paper on legal aspects of bilingual education and English as a second language. And I wanted a Mississippi connection. I wanted to really do a good job on this paper. And at that time, before the big Hispanic migration into the Southeast, the only ESL programs, English second language programs, were with the Vietnamese on the coast and with Choctaws in central Mississippi. But again, pre-internet, I didn't know how to get in contact with anybody. So I'm thinking about this, trying to figure out how to do this. And I go out early one day to the Faulkner House. It was about an hour earlier than we were normally open, but I didn't have anything better to do. So I went out there, opened up the house, and there was a group of people leaving. I said, if y'all want to wait a bit, I'm fixing to open up the house. And they said, oh, yeah, sure. So I asked one of these girls who was with the group, I said, well, where are y'all from? And she said, well, I'm from Czechoslovakia originally, but I live in Philadelphia, Mississippi right now. And I said, what in the world are you doing in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which at that time, pre-casinos, small town, 5,000 people, very unlikely place for, a Czech person to end up. And she said, well, I'm an ESL teacher on the Choctaw Indian Reservation. So I said, I need to talk to you. And I came down, observed her classes. That's how I found out about the job. Fast forward a little bit, when I got down to Philadelphia, Mississippi, again, like I said, very small town. Most people there have always been there. They, set up the circle of friends back when they were about 13. So I looked up this girl and said, hey, let's go, get a bite to eat or something sometime. And turns out she had a class once a week up in Oxford, which is 2.5 hours away. I was making all of $18,000 a year. So sharing a ride with somebody meant I could go up and see my friends versus not being able to see my friends. So I started riding up with her once a week. We were spending 5 hours a week in the car together talking. And 6 months later, I proposed, and 6 months after that, we got married. So it was but anyway, I taught history, social studies, and Spanish on the Choctaw Indian Reservation for a couple of years.
Extraordinary. So you end up becoming a foreign service officer for the Department of State. What does that job entail?
So, I was, like I said before, I was looking something long-term in the Foreign Service, and to get in the Foreign Service, the State Department, there's a battery of tests that you have to pass. Very competitive. So, one of the reasons I took the job on the reservation, because, this was not a sure thing, and it takes a long time. And I'd actually taken the Foreign Service exam. It's a written exam, multiple choice, once before, I think when I was still an undergraduate, and didn't pass. And then it was on hiatus for a lawsuit. I won't go into the lawsuit right now, but there's very humorous things about it. But anyway, it was on hiatus for a while. So anyway, I'm at the Choctaw Reservation. I take the test again and pass. And then once you pass that written test, then you are called to the oral exam, with the so-called oral exam. It's more than that, which are now only offered in Washington. Back then, there were about a half a dozen places where they offered. I took mine in Atlanta at the courthouse there. And it's a series of tests, some of which is oral. They just ask you questions about anything. There's a note-taking exercise. There's an essay. There's a role-playing exercise. It's all day long. And then at the end of that exam, you either pass or you don't. And anytime you don't pass, you go back to the beginning. And then you have your job interview. And you either pass or you don't. And then after that, you have your medical clearance, and you have your security clearance, and so on and so forth. So it can take months to even more than a year, because what happens is you go on a list and you're rank ordered according to how well you did on all your tests. And so, like, if you're 51 and they call in 50 people, technically you move up to the top of the list, but other people who take tests in the meantime may come in ahead or behind you. So it's never a sure thing. Anyway, to make it short, I took the test in, I guess it was the fall of one year, took the oral exam in the spring of that year, and it was basically about a year later that I got the invitation to come to Washington, D.C. and be part of the 61st Foreign Service Officer class back in 1992. and that's how that started. And when you go in, it was a little bit different when I came in, because when you come in now, you actually come in with a specialization, or what they call a cone, for some reason. And back then we came in unconed, and you got your specialization later, usually after a couple of years. But what you do is you come in with a specialization in one of now 5 areas, either consular, political, economic, management, or public diplomacy. And it doesn't mean all your jobs are going to be related to that, but it means the majority of your jobs are going to be related to that for you to be competitive. So for instance, if you are a management officer, you are going to be doing embassy or consulate management type positions, or personnel positions, or budget positions, and so on and so forth. If you're doing political, you're going to be doing political reporting. If you're doing you're doing economic reporting. If you're doing consular, you're going to be doing visas, passports, assistance to American citizens abroad. And public diplomacy, just what it sounds like, you're out there basically promoting to the general public American foreign policy goals. So I was a consular officer, which meant most of my career was dealing with either people wanting to come to the United States or Americans who were overseas. Anything from routine things like notarials and passports to people getting in trouble, arrested, dying, that kind of thing. But I did other things as well. I had some political economic positions, including in Iraq, and had a little bit of management, general management jobs. But of course, as a senior consular officer, then I was involved in consular management as well. But I spent 22 and a half years working directly as a Foreign Service officer before I retired in 2014. But I'm now what they call a reemployed annuitant, which means it's kind of like, you might say, a State Department reserves, that if they have issues somewhere, somebody's on leave, somebody's sick, there's a staffing gap, there's a sudden surge in demand, then they'll say, hey, Danny, you want to go to Lima, Peru, for instance, which is where I just was recently. And I do have the option of saying, yeah, I can't do it right now, but I can go. So I've been to a lot more countries since I retired than I have been while I was actually working full time.
And that having been said, you've been to some pretty interesting places: China, India, Greece, the Czech.
Yeah, well, as you know, a real Foreign Service officer, I was twice in Italy. I was in Poland. I was in Israel. I was in Ireland. I was in Germany, and also in southern Iraq during the war there at a provincial reconstruction team. Since leaving the Foreign Service officially, let's see, yeah, as you mentioned, China, El Salvador, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Greece, Moldova, Czech Republic, India, Spain, Albania, a few times at domestic passport agencies, Mexico, Peru. I think that's about it.
Yeah, that's a pretty great list for travel. Let's turn now and talk a little bit about what brought us together, and that is your book, The Rosary, an Incarnation of Prayer, which is published by Romanitas Press.
Right.
What was the starting point for this book? Where did you begin? Where did you think about maybe putting something down on paper? Because there've been a lot of books written about the Rosary.
Right. Well, to sort of back up. So one of the things I wanted to do when I retired was do a little bit of writing, because I had written a number of articles on a lot of different subjects, but also some on religious topics. I used to write when I was living in Ireland. I used to write occasionally for a small publication there called Brandsmall Review. Did half a dozen articles for them back in the early 2000s, and so I guess I had the conceit when I retired of thinking that I might be able to write something that somebody might actually want to read, and had a couple of books that I did have published. I had one on which is sort of an overview of American foreign policy from a non-interventionist perspective, that was written during the first Trump administration, and was published with Regnery Press, and they wanted to bring in, what Trump's ideas were at the time. So that's America First, Understanding the Trump Doctrine, which is still out there. Other book was about my experience in Southern Iraq, outside the wire, a Foreign Service officer in Southern Iraq, and that came out with a really small press out of the UK. And so then, I had written a few things for myself or for family regarding some of my thoughts on religious subjects. I have an unpublished manuscript on how I became Catholic that sometimes I share, particularly with people from the Churches of Christ that are, considering Catholicism or want to know more about Catholicism, and it details my path. So, but, getting back, we talked about earlier how one of the keys to my conversion, although I didn't realize it at the time, but one of the keys to conversion, I'm convinced, really was the Rosary. And I didn't notice this at the time, but when I was received into the Catholic Church in Philadelphia, Mississippi, it was at Holy Rosary Catholic Church. And I don't really believe in coincidences so much. This seemed like a culmination of what had happened before. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about the Rosary. I spent a lot of time praying the Rosary, of course. And one of the things I noticed, I guess I have sort of you might say, in some things, kind of a medieval mindset. And part of that is a fascination with the mystical significance of numbers. And there's a lot of numbers in the Rosary. When you think about it, it's a collection of beads. It's a numbered collection of beads that are grouped in different, ones and threes and fives and tens and so on. And I began meditating on these things as I prayed. And something seemed very obvious to me, and it came in. And as I looked out, I couldn't find that had been written about a lot. So through a lot of prayer and through a lot of meditation, I began to concentrate on some of these and write these down as, you might say, for lack of a better term, as they spoke to me. And so gradually over time, this became the basis of a manuscript. And I mean, despite the fact that there's a lot that you can think about, like, take the number 3, for instance, the Holy Trinity, and yesterday, today, tomorrow, all these kind of things, tied in, so much of life, youth, adulthood, old age, so much of these things, number 3, you could spend a lifetime thinking about the number 3. But, I could only come up with about 20 pages worth of, a number of stuff. So what I did is then so my book, the first part of it deals with this physicality of the Rosary, with the beads, with the numbers of the beads, and hence an incarnation of prayer. This is where prayer takes flesh, where prayer comes alive. Prayer becomes physical because we're fingering the beads as we're going through, and there's another layer of meaning there. So that's the first part. And then the second part, then I realized, okay, this would be a good opportunity to have my take on what thousands, if not millions, of other people have written about before, the mysteries, and how I had meditated on it, and what they meant to me. And so I hope that it's something that the first part I think is somewhat unique. There's probably something out, some manuscript out there that I'm just not aware of, but I haven't found it. So somewhat of a unique take for the person who's read every book on the Rosary. Maybe I'm offering something a little bit different. And then the second part is going to be your more traditional meditations, like you're used to in your typical Rosary books.
Yeah, I like that your emphasis in those early parts of the book. I think the chapter called "The Beads," emphasizing this idea, because sometimes I think that among modern man, there's a tendency to, when we pray, we think about it as a spiritual activity only, and it certainly, especially mental prayer, is primarily an act of the will and the intellect. But as human beings, we are kind of unique in that we have an eternal soul,
right?
And we, yet part of our very nature is matter. That's what makes us unique among all of creation. So the beads and our interaction with them is part of that reenaction of the salvation, the reenactment of salvation history that
right
that you talk about. Neat points.
Well, I think also, particularly among American Catholics, because we live in what was what has traditionally been a Protestant country. Now it's a post-Protestant country, but and so we imbibe some of this Protestantism, even unwillingly, and some of the prejudices, and there's you might say, a sort of Manichaean trend, within especially evangelical Protestant, which the body is bad, physical stuff is bad. It's all about the spirit. And so it's like, even from my own background in the Church of Christ, real strong prejudice against formal written prayer. Oh, it has to be all extemporaneous. It has to be spontaneous. It has to come from from within, which for one, it's just not sustainable, and for another, it basically over time becomes a sort of liturgical prayer, even if people don't admit to it. But yeah, so here we have something that you might say it grounds us, because we are flesh and spirit, and at Mass, when we go, we kneel, we stand, we sing, we touch things, we touch the holy water, we receive Jesus Christ physically there at the Mass. And so God created our bodies. God created us as incarnate beings. And so these are good things. And he realizes that we're not just, floating spirits. We also have a physicality to ourselves. And as such, after the Mass, the Rosary is the prayer par excellence, because it takes not just the mental prayer, not just the contemplation, not just the words, but even the actions of our hands, that we're touching something as we're praying and as we're communing with God. So we're involving both aspects of our being as we approach his throne.
And I think that's a neat reflection for many of our listeners, men who are in the business world, who are involved in some way, immediately or ultimately, in the production of things, the molding of stuff, the creation of physical objects, the employment of matter in the world to make the world a better place for mankind. So our God has created us not just as physical beings, but also to improve the physicality of the world in which we exhibit. Right, it started in the garden with the assignment of working the garden. So it's part of who we are, and I like what you've done with that. I think that's a really neat twist. You also spend some time in the book talking about how we're putting ourselves into the communion of saints through these activities of praying and reliving these mysteries. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we're one of the elements of the Rosary, and especially, you might say, when you're first praying the Rosary, it's kind of a mental reenactment. You're going to these scenes from sacred scripture and tradition, in the life of our Lord and in the life of Our Lady, and it's kind of putting yourself there. And so you're one of the things I always like, which I guess to modern man seems a bit hokey, but if you go to an art gallery and you look at some of these paintings, particularly from the Renaissance, and you'll have the crucifixion there, or you'll have the Annunciation, and over in the corner, here's this little guy looking on, who doesn't really belong to the system, and it's usually the patron, the guy who paid for the painting to be commissioned, and so they put him in there, and we look at that and we think that that's if not hokey, then at least a little tacky. But it was very heartfelt, because here's a person who wants to be a part of this scene, at least spiritually. And yeah, okay, he paid for it and everything like that. He commissioned it, and he's being put there also in recognition of that fact. But there's a deep spirituality there. Is I want to be present at these moments of our Lord's suffering, particularly, because this is what he did for me, and so it's very personal. And it's really easy to think of these things in the abstract, these are historical events, these things that took place. But if you put yourself there, which is what the Rosary helps us to do, then we become part of it, and we internalize this is not something that just happened, but happened because of and for me, because of my own sins, and for me, for the solution to the problem of my sin. So that's one of the ways that we can also look at the mysteries of the Rosary.
There was also another observation that you have that I thought ties in very well with us as Catholic men in the workforce and in business, trying to work out our salvation in fear and trembling, but also to grow in virtue and holiness in every aspect of our life. You referred to the mysteries, the praying of the Rosary as sort of a spiritual training regimen, and this idea that we immerse ourselves into the formal structure of the prayer, which Protestants really struggle with, as you know, you mentioned that already. But it occurred to me that, any man who's serious about something in his life, professionally, for example, he doesn't just have an idea, jump up and do it kind of spontaneously and without any plan. He maps out where he is, where he wants to go, how he's going to get there, the steps that are involved, the personnel, the whole plan. It becomes a formal process that he can execute on. And then you get other people involved, of course. And then you measure your success against milestones and step by step by step. It's a formal structure.
Right.
And that leads to a better outcome.
Yeah.
And so we all know that, but and you do the same thing too. If you're on a diet, if you're working out to lose weight, if you're going to tackle any project, you do that sort of thing. And there's this idea among modern man, even among some Catholics, of I'm spiritual but not religious, because religion implies this kind of formality in some parts.
Right. Yeah. It's you mentioned about working out, or there's so many people say, well, I tried praying the Rosary, but I didn't get anything out of it. Well, what does that mean? I tried and I didn't get anything out of it. What were you expecting to get out of it? But the other is, how long did you pray for? It's like, I grabbed some weights the other day and I started lifting them. I didn't see any change, but anybody who's done it, and I'm the last person to talk about body development. My body tends to develop just in a larger way rather than any kind of defined way. But if you have a weight training regime, you're not going to see results after your first week. In fact, probably it's going to be painful. Probably you're going to feel worse than you did before. And just like even with a spiritual regime such as the Rosary, you're going to find it, if you've never prayed the Rosary or have never seriously approached it, you're probably not going to, quote, get anything out of it the first few times you pray, because it takes concentration. It's easy to get distracted. And so you can, after 3 or 4 days, you say, oh, well, this isn't for me because I don't see any results. Same thing. I started lifting weights after 3 days. I didn't have muscles. And so I'm going to give it up. No, you stick with it. And then before you even know it, I mean, people who have done a lot of weight. Actually, I did some weight training when I was in Iraq because of lack of other things to do, and did see some results, but it's like all of a sudden one day you look in the mirror and you say, oh, wow, there's muscle development there. And same thing with the Rosary, particularly if you're concentrating on the process rather than the results, you're going to at a certain point in time think, well, I really have grown in this area. This is, this vice is not much of an issue anymore to me, or it's less of an issue, or I'm beginning to reflect on things I haven't even thought about. Or to use an extreme example, all of a sudden I'm finding myself drawn to the Catholic Church, which was my case. And here's a good example. I started praying the Rosary like 4 or 5 years before I became Catholic. And then I did a lot of reading, did a lot of studying, and came into the Catholic Church. It's almost as if God was giving me a sign. The real reason behind my conversion was when I was received in the Holy Rosary Catholic Church. It's like, there it is right there. I didn't know this at the time. I didn't realize it at the time. It's like the guy who's been training with weights and all of a sudden finds out he's really strong and said, must be following a better diet. No, it's the weight training there. And this is the same thing here. the Rosary it was conditioning my mind and above all my soul to receive the truths of the Catholic Church. But like anything else, like you mentioned, it takes some time and it takes discipline. And it's something that you have to stick with in order to see any kind of result.
To continue that line of thinking, the analogy of the working out, if you're praying the Rosary every day, as Our Lady called us to, she asked us to pray a terca, right, a third of the Rosary. If we're doing that every day, there will be changes.
Yes,
they're inevitable, right? It doesn't matter, if all you do every day is do a plank for 60 seconds in your bedroom, or a few sit-ups or a push-up, you're going to see some change. At the same time, if you alter that habit, if you stop the prayer, if you stop the workout, no matter at what level you were, you're going to see a deterioration.
right.
And so I think that analogy you've created for us is a good one. Let's chat just briefly about the promises. You have a chapter, and in my version, it's page 73, the promises of the Rosary. Don't necessarily need to review them all, but I think sometimes people forget this tradition that we have.
Right.
It's not a doctrine of the church, but it's a pious tradition. About the promises of the Rosary. Are there any there that you'd like to share with us or review?
Well, I mean, the one, and I think this is particularly resonates with me. In the version I have, it's the third one: a powerful armor against hell will destroy vice, decrease sin, and defeat heresies. I've seen this happen in my life. I mean, part of it is, obviously I still have a lot of ways to go in a lot of things, but there are certain temptations which, as I've prayed the Rosary over many years, are just not that appealing anymore. I mean, it's not a question of I'm just, so strong and powerful that I can resist them. They don't even present themselves anymore. And I attribute a lot of that to Our Lady's intercession through the prayers of the Rosary. One of the things you were saying before about, falling off and developing, I think one of the important things about the daily prayers of the Rosary is, as we are human beings with body, habit becomes important, and it's important to cultivate these holy habits, because when they become habits, guess what happens? You do it without even thinking about, it's not like, I've got to do the Rosary today. Oh my goodness. You do it. You do it automatically. It's just like if you're in the habit of attending, and going to Sunday Mass. Most faithful Catholics, it's not a decision. It's what you do. Just like when we have a job, we don't generally, probably a lot of us say, I wish I didn't have to go to work today, but it's not really a temptation if you have a responsible job and are a good worker. It's like, shall I go to work today? No, you're going to go to work today because otherwise you might get fired. It becomes second nature. And so that's one of the things. But yeah, that's one of the promises that really stick out. And tied with that, of course, is number 4, which is that the recitation of the Rosary will cause virtue and good works to flourish. Again, we're physical beings, and I remember a story, an anecdote about kind of a modernist priest who didn't like to wear, his clerical attire, and his argument was that the clothes are secondary. It's we're spiritual and so on and so forth. And the person said, well, but Father, if I'm looking and maybe I'm having some bad thoughts about somebody, or I'm having a temptation, I all of a sudden see a priest in his clericals. I see a nun in her habit, and immediately that draws me back, saying, oh, wait, maybe I shouldn't be thinking this way. And the priest says, well, that means your faith is weak if you need that. But it's like, yes, indeed, Father, I do need that, because I am not at the level where I am just at this exalted spiritual level that I can just rely on my own strength alone. I need the grace that comes to me by these outward signs. And one of those outward signs is, you wearing your clericals to bring me back to where I'm supposed to be. Just like it, when you're praying the rosary, when you have this physical thing in your hands, it's bringing you back to where you need to be. And one of the things, I mean, this is me talking, but I think it's really important to carry a rosary around, because at least for me, if I reach in my pocket, and I bring out my rosary, I carry it in my pocket, and it's not a magic talisman. It doesn't have power in and of itself. I mentioned in my book that it's wonderful. You should have the nicest rosary that you think you should have, but it's better to have a simple rosary that's prayed rather than a fancy one that sits on the shelf. But for me anyway, I can be out there. I've got that rosary in my pocket, and it grounds me. I touch it and I think, yes, okay, this is what I need to be thinking about. It's a reminder, and we need these kind of reminders to reconnect us to the spiritual, almost like an outlet, a plug, a charger.
A lot of people wear, for professional reasons, they wear a lanyard, or they wear something around their neck that identifies who they are, who they belong to, what their permissions are, what their access is, that sort of thing. I like seeing the rosary in that kind of way. I got to say, one of my favorite promises, number 7, those who have a true devotion to the rosary shall not die without the sacraments of the church.
Right. Yes.
That's a pretty great promise from Our Lady. As we wrap it up, there's one more point I want to cover, and that is the rosary as portable liturgy. We think of liturgy first and foremost as the Mass, and of course, liturgy is also the divine office, the breviary, the liturgy of the hours, especially for priests who pray that daily. And we oftentimes think of those liturgies as associated properly with a time and place. We go to Mass. Mass is at the church. The priest probably is praying his office at his rectory or at the church. But the rosary here is for the laity. We carry it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about the importance in your life, or even if you want to talk about men in general, of having this on-demand portable liturgy 24/7.
Well, it's again, and obviously we can pray anywhere, anytime, in any form, and we talk about formal prayer, and that's not to denigrate extemporaneous prayer. I mean, extemporaneous prayer is great, and I do it all the time, and we're told to pray without ceasing, and sometimes that's very difficult, though, which is why we do have a liturgical prayer, because I, for one, cannot always come up with the words that I need to address God. And it's nice that we have this tool. And another way of thinking about it is as a tool. Some of your listeners may be involved with using tools. And, if you're hammering nails, it's nice to have a hammer rather than trying to do it with your fist. So it's a tool to get the job of prayer done, to accomplish this type of communion with God. So when you've got your rosary with you, you're out there, and let's say I'm out there and I'm feeling bad, or let's say I'm out there and I'm subject to temptation, or let's say someone has brought something to my attention that for which they need prayers, or for which they've requested prayers. Yes, I can pray extemporaneous. It's not a problem. I can say an Our Father. I can say a Hail Mary. I can also take that tool that I have in my pocket and come up with and be able to present perfect prayers to our Lord. I mean, what could be more perfect than the prayer that the second person of the Trinity himself gave it? I mentioned one of the meditations that when I had this kind of awe moment, this moment of awe, an awesome moment in the traditional sense of the word, that when Jesus gives us the Our Father, we're talking about an internal communication of the Holy Trinity. Wow, gosh, I mean, that is quite amazing that we're privileged to, it's like a lot of stuff they've been talking about in politics recently about these, internal memos within the White House and so on and so forth. And, we always feel this sort of sense of almost prurient interest, and when we hear about these things being leaked or being released, well, how much more awesome memo could there be than this internal communication between the two members of the Holy Trinity, and we are given it as our own prayer to be able to use. And then we're also given the prayer of the Hail Mary that is, from the words of Scripture, the addressing Our Lady, and we're given these as gifts that we can use ourselves, and we're putting them together in this Holy Rosary as this great and powerful tool to really accomplish anything.
Yeah, I love that reflection. It's a great one. These insights into the internal goings-ons that we wouldn't normally, have access to. We wouldn't.
Right.
There's something there that is pretty special, and certainly the Pater Noster is the preeminent example of that. And then, of course, the second prayer that we repeat 53 times, the words of an angel.
Right. Exactly.
So. I think sometimes we're so familiar with the Rosary that we forget just how special it is, these words that we're repeating. And of course, for non-Catholics, especially Protestants who are hostile to it, when they denigrate it, I think it's great to step back and remind them, as you have just done for us, of the origin and to whom and from whom these words come.
Exactly.
We're participating not in some prayer that, our neighbor just came up with on the spot at some prayer meeting, but with divine words.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's what you mentioned there about, participating in something that, our neighbor didn't come. Sometimes we have this desire for novelty. We want something that's new. We want, I look at it, what's the latest, what's going on, but the thing about novel things is they soon become stale because they're not novel anymore. They're not new. And that's why, when we listen to music, we may have a preference for, say, I don't know, 70s rock, and it may be wonderful and it may be timeless. And so, but it is still, I mean, you can listen to it and that wasn't written yesterday. You also know it wasn't written in the 18th century. It was from a very specific time period, and you either like it or you don't like it, but it's dated. It comes from that. These things are timeless. These prayers are timeless. They never go out of style. And one of the things I tried to do in my book was by having some kind of different, I don't want to say novel thoughts because I don't think they are, but having some different approaches to it to reveal to maybe people who are stuck on some of the rote recitations of the Rosary without really thinking about it, to reveal that, wow, there's so many levels here, and that I've touched on a few of them. Maybe one of your listeners will say, he actually didn't talk about this part of it, which really appeals to me. And it's like, okay, that's great. Now you've got to write that book, and I'll read it too, so I can profit by it.
Great stuff. I'll give you the final word. What would you like to leave with our listeners? Don't forget, give us all the links, self-promotion here, where we can
right. Well,
any of your social media.
I don't know if this comes in frontwards or backwards, but it gives you an idea of the cover. It's a small book, as you can see. It's about what is it? About 80 pages, something like that. So this is a great book if you want. It'll fit in your carry-on without increasing your weight as you travel by plane. If you're going on pilgrimage, it will fit right in that backpack, so you can refer to it as. And I want to think of something as this book is something that you can read, and maybe it'll help you think about the Rosary in ways you haven't before. But also, I'm hoping for it to be like traditional Rosary books, an aid to meditation, so that something you can come back to again and again. Because like I said, I do have some reflections on all the mysteries, and maybe there's one or two things in there that you hadn't thought of. That's the hope anyway. It's, as was mentioned, it's at Romanitas Press. I think it's going for $13.50. Anyone out there that wants to buy a bulk amount, there's a bulk discount. The details are on the website at Romanitas Press. It also, for those of you all who are Kindle users, it is available on Kindle at Amazon, so you can go there. I don't remember what the price is. It's less than $13.50, but it is available on Kindle if you like having an even more portable version of it. So it's out there. We tried to keep it affordable so that it's not something that you have to decide between this book and supper, or sending your kids to college or something like that. I think that people will that there should be something in there that will appeal to almost anybody. If you're not really into numbers, that's okay. There's more to it than that. If you want a little bit of history of the Rosary, there's that in there as well. As you mentioned, the whole chapter is on the promises of the Rosary. I tried to pack a lot in 80 pages, and I hope that it's successful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great read, quick read. You could do it in one setting if you set aside the time and devote to it, and some nice nuggets to get out of there. Danny, thank you for your time today, and God bless you.
Thank you for having me on, and God bless you and your program.
Thank you.